Between the scorched mesas of Arizona and Sonora, the land seemed to breathe, slow, ancient, and full of memory. Every gust of wind that swept through the cactus fields carried stories of lost battles and whispered prayers. The desert was not dead. It was alive with secrets. And among them lived Ayoka, the widow who defied time and men. Her hut stood near a dry riverbed, built from sun-baked clay and cedar beams blackened by years of smoke. Behind it stretched miles of red earth, where the sun cracked the ground into a map of broken dreams. To anyone passing by, it looked like no place for a woman to live alone. But Ayoka was not just any woman. The locals called her the ghost of the canyon. She moved with the silence of a coyote and the grace of a hawk. Her long black hair was tied with a strip of leather that had once belonged to her husband, Taza, a warrior who had fought until his blood soaked the same earth he vowed to protect. She wore his knife on her hip and his courage in her heart. Since the day he fell, she had spoken little to anyone. Her world had shrunk to one purpose, guarding the last thing her husband had loved. A magnificent black stallion named Tempest. Tempest was not a horse. He was a legend stitched into the dust of the desert. His coat shimmered like wet obsidian under the sun, his mane flowing like smoke when he moved. His eyes, deep and furious, reflected both beauty and danger. He had belonged to Taza, and together they had once ridden through the canyons like lightning across the sky. But when Taza was killed by raiders, Tempest turned wild. He vanished into the mesas for weeks, and when Ayoka found him again, his coat was scarred, his spirit darker than before. He no longer trusted men. He allowed no one near him, not even her, not for long. Still she fed him, tended his wounds, and spoke to him in the Apache tongue of the heart, Nde Biati, the sacred language used to calm wild things. Slowly, he stopped baring his teeth when she approached. Slowly, he began to listen. Years passed, and whispers spread like wildfire through nearby towns. About the widow who owned a horse no man could tame. About the curse that haunted those who tried. About the challenge she made to every cowboy, every ranch hand, every fool brave enough to believe he was the one. "If you are a real man," she would say, her voice calm but cutting through the dust like a blade. "Prove it on my stallion. Ride Tempest for 10 minutes without being thrown. Then he will choose you. Fail, and the desert will remember your name among the broken." There was no gold, no glory, only pride. And that was enough. They came from everywhere: Tucson, Yuma, El Paso, even as far north as Santa Fe. Some came for honor, some came for ego. Some came because the legend itself was too loud to ignore. They brought fancy saddles, braided ropes, silver spurs, and tongues slick with bravado. The first man lasted 12 seconds. The second lasted 8. The third, a rodeo star from New Mexico, didn't last long enough to draw breath. Tempest's fury was silent but absolute. He didn't buck wildly like an untrained colt. He measured his strength. He threw men the way a storm throws lightning, precise, unmerciful, and inevitable. Ayoka watched each attempt from her porch. Never once did she flinch or shout or intervene. Her eyes, dark as storm clouds, followed the riders until they hit the ground. Then she would whisper a short prayer, not for the man, but for the horse. When the 25th challenger limped away, beaten and humiliated, the people of Bisbee and Tombstone began calling the stallion the Devil's Shadow. They said the widow was cursed, that she kept her dead husband's spirit alive through that horse, that any man who tried to take his place would be punished. But the truth was simpler. Ayoka was waiting, not for a conqueror, not for a hero, but for someone who understood what her husband had once said before he died. The spirit of a horse is like the spirit of a free man. You cannot break it. You can only walk beside it. And so she waited. Days turned into weeks, and the wind kept carrying the same stories across the border towns. The widow's challenge, the unridable stallion, the men who failed. Until, one evening, a stranger in a dust-stained hat rode through the valley. The sun was setting over the Sierra Madre, painting the sky in molten gold and crimson. The air smelled of dry sage and old gunpowder. Bo Ransom rode alone on his bay gelding, copper, the horse's hooves kicking up dust like tiny ghosts in the dying light. He wasn't a drifter or a bounty hunter. He wasn't a man looking for fame. He was simply tired of noise, of people, of the kind of silence that comes from living too long with regret. Bo owned a small ranch north of the border, a patch of land that barely grew mesquite, but enough to keep him working sunup to sundown. His life had been made of simple things: hard soil, old scars, and the ache that comes from remembering too much. But something about the story of the Apache widow stirred him. Not the challenge, but the way it was told. There was something honest in it. Something that spoke to a man who'd forgotten how to listen. By the time Bo reached the canyon, the air was thick with dusk. He saw the corral before he saw the woman. Tempest stood inside, massive and still, his coat glimmering under the fading light like black fire. The horse turned his head as Bo approached, ears flicking forward, eyes sharp and curious. And then she appeared. Ayoka, standing barefoot on the packed earth, wrapped in a shawl the color of desert dusk. The wind caught strands of her hair, and for a moment, she looked less like a woman and more like the spirit of the land itself. "Another one?" she asked, her tone flat, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Bo removed his hat, his voice quiet. "Just passing through, heard the stories. Everyone hears the stories." She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "But stories are smoke. They fade. Do you seek smoke or fire?" Bo met her eyes and didn't look away. "Maybe I'm looking for something that still burns." Her expression softened, just slightly. "Then you've come to the right place." The following morning, Bo stood by the corral fence, watching Tempest move. The stallion was all power and poetry, his muscles rolling under his coat like thunder under cloud. Each snort sent dust flying in the air. Ayoka joined him, carrying a small flask of water. She handed it to him without a word. Their hands brushed, calloused, worn, and human. "I've seen men with better gear, stronger arms," she said, "and all of them fell. Do you know why?" Bo shook his head. "They tried to win," she said simply. "Tempest doesn't bow to winners. He listens to those who know how to lose with grace." Bo smiled faintly. "Then maybe I've already got what it takes." He stepped into the corral, unarmed, unhurried. The crowd that had gathered from nearby villages held its breath. Tempest turned toward him, ears flicking, tail whipping the air like smoke. Bo didn't move closer. He just stood, letting the silence fill the space between them. Minutes passed. The sun rose higher, burning through the haze. Sweat traced lines down Bo's temples, but he didn't waver. Finally, Tempest took a step forward, then another. The earth vibrated beneath each hoofbeat. Bo whispered something under his breath, words lost in the wind. And when the stallion reached him, their eyes met, man and beast, both scarred, both tired of fighting. For a heartbeat, the world went still. Ayoka watched from the fence, her hand gripping the post. She saw it, the shift, the acceptance. For the first time in 3 years, Tempest didn't strike, didn't rear, didn't retreat. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring, and breathed against Bo's chest, a gesture older than any language. The crowd murmured. Someone whispered a prayer. And Ahyoka, her throat tight, whispered one too. But this time it wasn't for the horse. It was for the man. The desert had seen countless riders and countless storms. But that day, it witnessed something rarer, the beginning of a bond between two souls that understood what it meant to be broken and still choose to stand. And though the sun burned hotter, the wind sang softer, as if even the land itself paused to listen. Because somewhere between the widow and the stranger, between the storm and the silence, a story had begun, one that would outlive both of them. The wind rolled low across Sierra Vista Valley, carrying dust and the smell of dry mesquite. It moved like a ghost through the canyons, whispering to those who knew how to listen. Bo Ransom had always listened, to the land, to the silence, and to the ache that had followed him since the war. He didn't talk much about the battles he'd seen, or the friends who'd never come back. Those stories lived behind his eyes, where no one dared to go. The war had taken plenty, his family, his laughter, and the easy way a man once trusted the world. What it left behind was a man who worked hard, spoke little, and let the desert shape what was left of him. His ranch sat on the edge of nothing, a stretch of stubborn earth fenced by barbed wire and prayer. The soil was rough, but it fed a few horses and a couple dozen head of cattle. He didn't need more. Work gave rhythm to the emptiness. The creak of saddle leather, the scrape of boots against gravel, the hiss of coffee on a campfire. That was Bo's kind of music. But one evening, as he sat by the fire with only the wind and the distant howl of coyotes for company, he heard talk on the trail from a pair of ranch hands heading south. They spoke of a widow Apache, a woman said to be fierce as the land she lived on, and her black stallion, a creature no man had ever managed to ride. "They say the horse has got the devil in him," one of them said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Nah," the other replied. "That horse ain't cursed. He just ain't found the right soul yet." Bo didn't say a word, but later that night, long after the fire burned down to embers, he found himself staring into the darkness and thinking about that horse, and about the woman who guarded him. He didn't know why it stuck in his mind. Maybe it was because he understood what it meant to live caged by ghosts. Maybe he saw something of himself in that unbroken stallion, something wild that refused to kneel, even after being hurt. When the morning came, he packed light: a bedroll, some jerky, a tin of coffee, and a rifle that hadn't seen a bullet in weeks. He locked up the ranch house, left a note tacked to the barn door that said only, "Gone south, back when the wind allows." Then he mounted his horse, Copper, and rode toward the desert sun. The ride to the borderlands took 3 days. He crossed endless plains where the ground shimmered under the heat, past wind-carved rocks shaped like the faces of old gods, through arroyos where dry riverbeds twisted like veins in the earth. At night, he camped beneath the wide Arizona sky, where the stars looked close enough to touch. By the time he reached the foothills of the Huachuca Mountains, the land began to change. Mesquite gave way to yucca and tall ocotillo, their thorny arms raised like sentinels in the wind. The days burned hot. The nights froze sharp. It was the kind of country that tested a man, where the weak went home and the stubborn learned patience. When he finally crested the last ridge and looked down into Ahyoka's valley, he stopped his horse and just sat there, taking it in. The place looked carved from legend, a bowl of red earth surrounded by cliffs, with a small adobe house standing near a spring-fed creek. Smoke rose from a chimney, and beyond it, fenced in with cedar posts, stood the corral. Inside it was a shape so dark it seemed to drink the sunlight, the stallion called Tempest. Even from that distance, Bo could feel the animal's energy. The horse paced like a storm cloud waiting to break. Each step carried the weight of restrained fury, a reminder that this was no ordinary beast. He nudged Copper forward. By the time he reached the ranch, the wind had picked up. Dust swirled around him like spirits of the old desert. Then the door of the adobe house opened, and Ahyoka stepped out. She wasn't what he expected. She didn't wear bright beads or feathers like the dime novel stories painted her kind. She wore buckskin pants tucked into old riding boots, a faded red shawl around her shoulders, and her long black hair braided down her back. Her face was calm, but her eyes, dark and cutting, held the kind of silence that comes from living too close to pain. "You've come far," she said, her voice low but steady. "Long way for a horse I'm not sure I can ride," Bo replied, tipping his hat. Ahyoka studied him for a moment, her gaze measuring. "Most men come with pride in their pockets. You came with doubt in your voice. That's different." "Maybe I just learned what pride costs," Bo said. A faint smile touched her lips. "Then maybe you'll listen better than the others." She turned and gestured toward the corral. "You can see him from there, but don't cross the fence. He decides when a man is close enough." Bo leaned against the fence rail, eyes fixed on Tempest. The stallion moved like thunder wrapped in flesh, smooth, deliberate, dangerous. His muscles rippled under his black coat, and each time he turned, the sunlight caught the scar along his shoulder. An old wound, long healed but not forgotten. Bo watched quietly. He didn't whistle, didn't speak, didn't try to draw attention. He just let the horse feel him there, like a new wind entering the valley. After a while, Ahyoka joined him. She didn't speak either, just stood beside him, her shawl fluttering in the breeze. Finally, she said, "He doesn't trust men, not since Taza." Bo nodded. "Taza, your husband?" She looked toward the horizon, where the mountains burned orange in the sunset. "He was a warrior, fought for our land. When he died, Tempest disappeared for weeks. When he came back, he wasn't the same. Neither was I." Bo didn't ask for details. He knew the shape of grief when he saw it. It wore the same eyes he carried in his own reflection. "He ever let anyone near him since?" "No, not even me for long," she said. "But he listens when I sing." Then, almost as if to prove her words, she began humming, a low, rhythmic tune that seemed to come from the ground itself. The wind softened. The stallion slowed his pacing. His ears flicked forward, his tail swayed once, twice, and then he stood still. The sound was haunting, not quite a song, not quite a prayer. It wrapped around the valley like smoke from a sacred fire. Bo felt it deep in his chest, a vibration that stirred something he thought long dead. When the song faded, Ahyoka turned to him. "You still want to try?" Bo took a breath, feeling the dry air burn his throat. "I didn't ride all this way to watch from the fence." The next morning dawned pale and cool. The desert smelled of rain that would never come. Bo walked to the corral at first light. Ahyoka was already there, standing by the gate with her shawl pulled tight. She handed him a simple halter made of braided leather. No bit, no saddle. "He doesn't allow metal," she said. "Too many scars from it." Bo nodded. He stepped into the corral. The sound of his boots on the dirt was the only noise. Tempest lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes sharp. "Easy," Bo murmured, his voice steady, slow. "I'm not here to break you, boy." He didn't move closer. He just stood, the same way he'd watched wild mustangs on his ranch, waiting for them to decide. Minutes passed. The stallion snorted once, stamping the ground, testing the air between them. Ahyoka's voice drifted from the fence. "He's reading your heart. If you lie, he'll know." Bo almost smiled. "Then maybe we'll get along just fine." The horse tilted his head. Then, step by step, he closed the distance. The world seemed to narrow until there was nothing but man, horse, and wind. When Tempest finally stopped within reach, Bo lifted his hand, slow, open, no threat. The stallion's breath hit his palm, warm and damp. For a moment they stayed that way. Two creatures, both weary of fighting, both still standing. Ahyoka exhaled softly. Bo whispered, "You're not the only one who's been hurt." He took another step. The stallion didn't move. His muscles twitched, but his eyes stayed on Bo, curious, alert, unafraid. And then, in one motion that felt less like a decision and more like destiny, Tempest lowered his head. Bo touched his neck, running his hand gently along the line of muscle and scar. The horse's skin shivered but didn't pull away. "That's it," Bo murmured. "Just breathe." The corral went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Ahyoka's voice was barely a whisper. "He's never done that for anyone." Bo didn't look back. He knew something had shifted, not just in the horse, but in himself. For the first time in years, the weight on his chest eased just a little. He turned toward Ahyoka, his hand still resting on Tempest's neck. "Looks like he's giving me a chance." She smiled faintly, a warmth in her eyes that the desert had long forgotten how to hold. "Then don't waste it, cowboy." Bo nodded. Wouldn't dream of it. He stayed there until the sun broke full over the mountains, his hand never leaving the stallion's hide. And when the first light touched both their faces, the wind returned, softer now, carrying with it the promise of something new. In that golden silence, Bo understood. This wasn't about riding a wild horse. It was about earning back a piece of his own soul. And for the first time in a long while, Bo Ransom felt something he thought the war had buried forever. Hope. The desert held its breath that evening. The air shimmered with heat even after the sun began to sink, turning the sky to rust and gold. Dust rolled across the valley like smoke from a dying fire, and the scent of creosote mingled with something older, the electric tension that comes before change. Bo Ransom rode down the slope slowly, his bay horse kicking up clouds that caught the last of the sunlight. The land stretched out around him, vast, unforgiving, and strangely alive. Every cactus, every boulder seemed to watch him as he moved closer to the heart of the valley. And there she was. Ahyoka stood near a small fire, her figure framed by the flame's orange light. She looked carved from the same earth that surrounded her. Skin bronzed by the sun, her hair braided with a strip of red cloth that fluttered in the evening wind. Her deerskin tunic was the color of the desert floor, worn soft with time. She wasn't adorned with gold or jewelry. Her beauty came from stillness, that rare kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself. Bo stopped a few paces away, removed his hat, and let the silence stretch between them. "You found your way," she said, her tone flat but not unkind. "Wasn't easy," Bo replied, his voice low. "Your valley doesn't exactly welcome strangers." "The desert never welcomes anyone," she said, eyes steady on him. "It tests them, like Tempest." Her gaze flicked toward the corral, where the black stallion stood at the edge of the shadows. Even in the dim light, Bo could see the gleam of muscle under that obsidian coat. Tempest lifted his head and let out a low, rumbling snort, the kind of sound that came from deep inside, somewhere close to the soul. "He's bigger than I imagined," Bo murmured. "He's more than a horse," Ahyoka said softly. "He's what's left of my husband's spirit, wild, proud, and impossible to hold." Bo nodded, saying nothing. He understood that kind of loss, how something could take root in the empty space someone leaves behind. For a while, neither spoke. The only sound was the wind sliding across the sand, carrying the hiss of the fire. Then Ahyoka turned to him, her face unreadable. "Tell me, Bo Ransom," she said. "Why are you here?" He looked at her for a long time, the firelight flickering in his eyes. "Not for gold, not for pride. I guess I just want to see if that horse can hear a heart that's been broken as long as mine has." Ahyoka studied him in silence, then nodded once, a small gesture, but it carried the weight of something sacred. "Then maybe Tempest will listen." They ate a quiet supper of beans and flatbread beneath the stars. Bo sat cross-legged near the fire while Ahyoka fed dry twigs to the flames. Above them, the sky was endless, a sea of cold blue-black pierced by constellations that looked close enough to reach. "This land," Bo said after a while, "it's beautiful, in a hard way." Ahyoka smiled faintly. "It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be kind." Bo chuckled under his breath. "Sounds like both of us." She looked up at him, and for the first time that night, her eyes softened. "You carry a quiet kind of sadness, Bo Ransom. It walks beside you like a shadow. Guess we make good company, me and my shadow." He poked at the fire with a stick. "War changes a man, makes him forget what peace feels like." She nodded slowly. "My people say the spirit breaks like a tree in the storm. But if the roots are deep, it grows again, stronger, even if it's never the same." Bo met her gaze. "You believe that?" "I have to," she said simply. A gust of wind swept through the camp then, scattering ash and sand. Tempest let out a low cry from the corral. Not fear, not anger, but something restless. The stallion pawed at the dirt, tossing his mane as if the night itself had stirred his blood. Bo stood and walked toward the corral fence, stopping just short of the gate. The horse turned toward him, ears flicking, eyes like polished coal reflecting the firelight. "You feel it too, don't you?" Bo murmured. The waiting. Tempest took a step forward, then another, his hooves silent in the sand. Ahyoka rose from the fire and joined him, the flames painting her skin in copper and gold. "He knows something's coming," she said. "He feels what the wind hides." "Tomorrow?" Bo asked. She nodded. "Tomorrow." The night deepened. Coyotes called from the hills, their cries rising and falling like the song of ghosts. Bo lay on his bedroll outside the corral, staring up at the stars. He could hear Tempest breathing in the dark, steady and deep, like thunder sleeping. Sleep came slow. His mind wandered to old memories, the sound of gunfire, the flash of uniforms, the sight of smoke curling from the wreckage of a farmhouse that once held laughter. He thought of the woman he'd loved and lost, the way her hand had slipped from his as the fever took her. He turned on his side, the pain a familiar ache in his chest. Across the camp, Ahyoka sat awake by the dying fire, humming a tune so soft it barely reached him. The melody wove through the night, old and mournful, sung in a tongue older than the desert itself. Bo closed his eyes, letting the song wash over him. He didn't know the words, but he understood them all the same. They spoke of grief and endurance, of things that refused to die. When dawn came, it found him standing at the corral, hat in hand, watching the light spill over the mountains like molten gold. Ahyoka appeared beside him, wrapped in her shawl. Her expression was calm, but there was a spark in her eyes. Not hope, not fear, something between them. "He's ready," she said. "Are you?" Bo thought for a long moment. Then he smiled, a quiet, weary smile that felt like it came from someplace long buried. "I reckon I am." They opened the gate. The stallion stepped into the open, his mane whipping in the early wind. The morning sun hit his coat, turning it into living metal, black and burning at once. Bo didn't move right away. He just stood, letting the horse size him up. Ahyoka stayed near the fence, silent. Her people believed moments like this didn't belong to witnesses. They belonged to the earth and the sky. Bo spoke low, steady. "You and me, boy. We've both been through hell. Let's see if we can find a little peace." Tempest's ears flicked forward. He didn't charge, didn't bolt. Instead, he walked, slow, measured, deliberate. Bo extended his hand, palm open. The stallion's nostrils flared as he caught the man's scent. Then, with the caution of something that had learned pain the hard way, he leaned forward until his breath touched Bo's skin. "That's it," Bo whispered. "That's all I need." He ran his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the warmth beneath the coat, the heartbeat that matched his own. The scars were there, raised lines under the hair, reminders of the whips, the ropes, the men who thought strength was louder than respect. "Not today," Bo said softly. "Today, nobody owns you." The stallion didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head, as if considering the man's words. Bo took a step closer, then another. His movements were slow, deliberate, every muscle speaking the language of calm. He reached for the makeshift halter Ahyoka had left by the post and looped it gently around the horse's neck. Tempest tensed for a heartbeat. Then, surprisingly, he let it stay. Ahyoka's breath caught, but she didn't move. Bo swung one leg over, his boot finding the stirrup, and eased himself onto the stallion's back. The world went silent. Even the wind stopped. Tempest shuddered once, a tremor that ran through every muscle, but he didn't rear. Bo's hands were light on the rope, his balance perfect, his body speaking in rhythm with the animal beneath him. For a moment they stood still, man and horse, shadow and fire. Then Tempest moved. One step, another, then a slow, deliberate trot that rippled through the ground. Bo felt every motion, every breath, every beat of the heart beneath him. It wasn't a battle. It was a conversation. A fragile one, built on the edge of trust. Ahyoka's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to shed. Her lips moved in silent prayer, for the stallion, for the stranger, for the chance that both might finally find what they'd lost. Tempest lifted his head to the wind and let out a cry that shook the canyon walls. It wasn't rage. It was release, a sound of defiance and freedom all at once. Bo smiled, his heart hammering in his chest. "Yeah," he whispered, "I hear you." As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the valley, Ahyoka knew what she was witnessing wasn't a conquest. It was redemption, for both of them. And though the day was just beginning, something inside her whispered that this was the moment the desert had been waiting for. The storm before the calm, the man before the miracle. Because sometimes the wild doesn't need to be tamed. It just needs to be understood. The corral was silent except for the wind whispering through the mesquite. Dust hung in the air like a memory refusing to settle. Even the sun seemed to hold still above the red horizon, watching. Bo Ransom stood inside the pen, the earth cracked and dry beneath his boots. There were no ropes, no spurs, no saddle, just a man, a horse, and a silence deep enough to feel in his bones. Tempest was larger up close, all black fire and coiled thunder. His mane shifted like smoke when he moved, his nostrils flaring with suspicion and power. Every muscle in his body trembled with the question every wild creature asked. "Are you danger or peace?" Bo didn't answer with words. He just breathed. He had learned long ago that horses could read a man faster than any human could. They knew the truth under your skin. If your heart was steady, if your fear was louder than your calm, if you meant harm even before you raised a hand. And so Bo did nothing. He didn't reach out, didn't step closer. He simply stood, his voice deep and steady as a canyon wind. "Easy now," he said softly, almost like a prayer. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you today." The stallion's ears flicked forward, his eyes, dark as obsidian, fixed on Bo. He pawed at the dirt once, testing the space between them, then snorted, a low, thunderous sound that rolled through the corral like warning. Bo didn't move. He just let the air settle, let the desert breathe through him. Minutes passed, long enough for the spectators outside the fence to shift uneasily. A few cowhands leaned on the rails, whispering bets under their breath. Ahyoka stood apart from them, arms folded, her shawl pulled tight against the dry wind. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes never left the pair in the pen. Then something changed. Tempest took a single step forward, then another. It was cautious, deliberate, the kind of movement that came from curiosity, not surrender. Bo lowered his gaze, not in fear, but in respect. A show of trust. He murmured again, his words low and rhythmical, blending with the hum of the desert. "That's it. Ain't no harm here. Just wind and dust, same as you." The stallion's breath came in heavy bursts, warm and sharp with the scent of grass and wild air. He stopped within reach, head high, watching every twitch of Bo's hand. The cowboy didn't move, didn't even blink. And then, slowly, as if guided by something older than instinct, Tempest leaned forward, his muzzle brushing against Bo's open palm. The touch lasted only a moment. But in that instant, the corral changed. The air lightened. The men at the fence went still. Ahyoka pressed a hand to her chest. It was the sign she'd been waiting for, the sign her husband had once spoken of, the sign of Nahana, connection. Bo let his hand slide gently along the horse's neck, feeling the ripples of power beneath the skin. "That's right," he murmured. "We're just talking, you and me." Tempest's muscles twitched but didn't pull away. The stallion turned his head slightly, almost like he was weighing this strange human's courage against his own. And whatever he found, it must have been enough. Because when Bo shifted his weight, lifting one boot onto the rail and swinging his leg over, Tempest didn't move. The cowboy settled onto the horse's back like a man stepping into church, reverent, silent, aware that one wrong breath could shatter the miracle. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "He's crazy." Another whispered, "He won't last a minute." But Ahyoka said nothing. Her eyes glimmered with something the others didn't understand. Recognition. Bo didn't grab for reins or kick for motion. He just sat, feeling the heartbeat under him, wild, steady, alive. For a long moment, neither man nor horse moved. Then, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long across the ground, Tempest shifted. One hoof, then another. He started walking. The first few steps were uncertain, each one measured like a test. But when Bo didn't fight, didn't push, the stallion found his rhythm. His muscles rolled under Bo's legs like a tide returning to shore. The crowd gasped. A few men leaned forward, mouths open. Bo felt the power of it, not like riding a horse, but like catching hold of the wind itself. His body moved with Tempest's stride, hands loose, breathing in time with the animal's breath. "That's it, boy," he whispered. "You lead, I'll follow." And somehow, that was enough. Tempest began to circle the corral, slow at first, then faster. The dust rose around them in a golden haze. It clung to Bo's shirt, his hat, the sweat on his brow. But he didn't care. The world had shrunk to the space between his heartbeat and the stallion's. Ahyoka's lips parted as she watched them. She had seen men try to dominate that horse, to twist, to break, to control. But this was different. Bo wasn't conquering. He was listening. Tempest's ears pricked forward. He tossed his head once, a flash of pride, then broke into a canter, smooth and graceful as a river running free. Bo leaned forward just enough, his body moving with the rhythm, his voice low and steady. "Go on then," he said softly. "Show me what freedom feels like." The stallion answered. He surged into a gallop that shook the ground. The wind roared past Bo's ears, the fence posts blurred. Every heartbeat thundered in his chest like war drums. But his fear melted away, replaced by something purer, awe. He wasn't riding on the horse anymore. He was riding with him. Two souls moving through the same storm. For the first time in years, Bo felt weightless. The ache that had haunted him since the war, the guilt, the silence, the endless emptiness, lifted. He laughed. A short, rough sound that startled even himself. And somehow, the stallion seemed to laugh too. They raced together under the bleeding sky, the sun throwing their shadows long and wild across the desert floor. The corral could barely contain them. The air itself seemed to hum with something sacred, the sound of trust being reborn. When they finally slowed, the world was painted in twilight. The sky burned red, fading to indigo. Bo eased the horse into a walk, then a halt. Tempest stood still, sides heaving, eyes bright and alive. The cowboy reached down and patted his neck. "You did good, partner," he said quietly. Tempest flicked his ears back, then forward again, a gesture as subtle as a handshake between old friends. From the fence, Ahyoka stepped forward, her face lit by the last light of day. 15 minutes, she called softly. Bo blinked. "What?" "You've been on his back 15 minutes, she said, smiling now. "The others never made it to 10. He looked down at Tempest, then back at her. "Guess we both needed that. You didn't just ride him," Ahyoka said. "You reminded him what it means to trust." Bo dismounted slowly, his legs trembling with exhaustion, and something else. Reverence. When his boots hit the ground, Tempest stayed close, lowering his head to nudge Bo's shoulder. The crowd behind the fence erupted in quiet disbelief, murmurs, whistles, a few cheers. But Bo barely heard them. His world had narrowed to the warmth of the horse beside him and the woman watching from the firelight. Ahyoka crossed the corral, her steps slow and sure. She reached out and touched Tempest's mane, then looked up at Bo. "He's never done that before," she said. "Not since my husband." Bo held her gaze. Then maybe it's not just him learning to trust again. For a long moment they stood in silence, the kind that means more than words. The desert wind moved around them, soft now, carrying the scent of sage and something else, the promise of change. Tempest let out a deep breath and stepped away, moving toward the open gate. He didn't run, didn't rear, just walked into the coming night, calm and free. Bo watched him go, his heart full and quiet. He turned to Ahyoka, who stood beside him, eyes reflecting the fading light. "He'll come back," she said softly. "I know," Bo replied. "He knows where home is." She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that warmed the cool air. "And what about you, Bo Ransom? Do you know where home is?" Bo looked out toward the horizon where the stallion had vanished. The wind tugged at his hat, carrying away the dust and the last traces of doubt. "Maybe I'm starting to," he said. That night, the desert slept differently. The stars seemed closer. The wind was kinder. Ahyoka tended the fire while Bo sat nearby, staring into the flames. Neither spoke for a while. Then she said quietly, "You changed him." Bo shook his head. "No, ma'am. He changed me." The fire popped, sending a trail of sparks into the dark. Ahyoka watched them rise and fade. "The desert chooses who it listens to," she said. "Today, it listened to you." Bo looked at her, then at the endless night sky. "Maybe it was time," he said. The woman nodded slowly. Maybe it was. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, Tempest whinnied once, a long, echoing call that rolled through the canyons like thunder softened by rain. Ahyoka smiled faintly. "He's telling you something." Bo tilted his head. "What's he saying?" She met his eyes, her voice like wind over stone. "He's saying the storm has finally found peace." When Tempest stopped, the dust hung thick in the air like a prayer unfinished. The stallion's sides heaved, his nostrils flaring, the heat of his breath mixing with the smell of sweat and sun-baked earth. Bo sat still on his back, not daring to move. 15 minutes had passed, maybe more, but time had lost its shape somewhere between the rhythm of Tempest's strides and the pounding in Bo's chest. Ahyoka stepped forward through the haze, her shawl caught in the breeze, her eyes bright with something that looked like both fire and forgiveness. She placed her hand over her heart as she spoke. "You've done what only my husband ever could," she said quietly. Bo swung his leg over and slid down, boots meeting the dirt with a soft thud. "I didn't come to win," he said, voice rough from dust and emotion. "I came to find something I lost." Her gaze held his. "And did you find it?" He nodded once, slow and certain. "Maybe I did, a place to belong." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Ahyoka stepped closer and reached for the halter, her fingers brushing Bo's. "You should stay," she said. "Help me with the land. Help me with him." Bo looked past her to the wide valley, the grazing hills, the dry riverbed, the corral where the earth still held the marks of Tempest's hooves. It was rough country, but honest. The kind of place that demanded everything and gave nothing easily. He smiled faintly. "I reckon I could do that." By the end of the week, Bo had moved into a small cabin near the north pasture. The place had been empty for years, its roof sagging a little, its windows clouded with dust. But when he struck a match to the fireplace and smelled the cedar smoke rise, it already felt like home. The days came early. The desert dawn didn't creep in. It arrived all at once, pouring gold over the mesa and filling the air with the sound of waking birds. Bo learned the rhythm of Ahyoka's ranch quickly, feeding horses before the sun hit the horizon, checking the fence lines, patching roofs that hadn't seen care since before the war. Tempest watched him the way a hawk watches the sky, wary, curious, ready. But each morning when Bo brought water to the trough, the stallion came a little closer. By the third day, he no longer shied away from the sound of Bo's boots. By the fifth, he took an apple from his hand. "He remembers," Ahyoka said, watching from the porch one evening. "Remembers what?" Bo asked. "What it feels like to trust." Bo smiled. then maybe we're both learning again. There was work enough to keep them both busy. The land was stubborn, full of rocks and sun-hardened clay that swallowed every drop of rain it got. But Bo liked the struggle. There was something honest about hard labor. Fixing fences, mending gates, running his hands through the dirt and feeling life buried underneath. In the evenings, when the heat broke and the world turned amber, they'd sit on Ayoka's porch. She'd brew strong coffee over the fire while the last light faded from the valley. Some nights they talked about the work, calves born too small, storms that might roll through the mountains. Other nights, they didn't talk at all. They just sat, letting the silence speak in the language of people who'd spent too many years alone. "You don't say much," Ayoka told him one night. Bo chuckled softly. "Words got me in more trouble than they ever fixed." "Maybe," she said, smiling faintly. "But silence can hide too much." He glanced at her, the firelight catching the faint scar on his cheek, the kind that told stories better left untold. "What about you? You've got a quiet that runs deep." "My people say quiet is how you hear the world's truth," she said. "But sometimes I wonder if I've just been listening to ghosts." Bo looked out over the land, where tempest grazed in the moonlight. "Maybe ghosts don't stay unless they've got something left to see." Ayoka tilted her head, her voice almost a whisper. "And what about your ghosts, Bo Ransom? Do they follow you still?" He thought about the war, about the faces that still visited him in his sleep. He thought about the ranch he'd left behind, the graves he didn't have the courage to visit. Then he looked at her, really looked. "They're quieter here," he said. As summer deepened, the valley began to change. The rains came late but heavy, turning the dry wash into a river for a few short days. Grass sprouted in the lower fields, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Tempest ran through the pastures at dawn, his black coat gleaming, the spray of mud under his hooves catching the light like sparks. Bo had never seen anything so alive. He rode beside him sometimes, not to command, just to move in rhythm. They'd gallop along the ridges, the wind tearing through Bo's shirt, the stallion's breath hot and loud beside him. It wasn't the wild rush of conquest. It was the steady heartbeat of understanding. Ayoka watched them from a distance, her shawl pulled tight, the wind tangling her hair. There was pride in her eyes, but something else too. The quiet recognition that healing didn't always come from solitude. That fall, Bo fixed the north fence and helped dig a new well. He found himself humming as he worked, small things, tunes he hadn't remembered knowing. He even started carving again, shaping a piece of mesquite wood into the likeness of a running horse. When Ayoka saw it, she smiled. "You have hands that make things live again," she said. Bo shrugged. Hands just need something to do besides remember. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ayoka handed him a bowl of stew and sat beside him on the porch. The scent of sagebrush drifted through the air. Tempest grazed near the creek, the water reflecting the last of the light. "You've brought peace here," she said after a long silence. Bo looked at her, then down at his hands. "Maybe peace was already here, just needed someone to notice." Her gaze softened. "You speak like a man who's been lost." He smiled faintly. "Ain't we all?" They sat that way until the stars came out, the wide, unblinking kind that only desert skies can hold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry long and lonely but not sad. It sounded like the valley itself, vast, echoing, alive. Over time, the people in the nearby town started to talk. They said the Apache widow had taken in a white rancher. They said he'd tamed the devil's horse and softened the woman's heart. Some said it was scandal, others said it was destiny. But Ahyoka and Bo didn't care for gossip. The desert didn't run on rumors. It ran on sweat and sun and the unspoken understanding between those who worked it. Still, there were moments, small ones, quiet as rainfall, when something deeper stirred between them. The way her hand brushed his when she passed him a cup of coffee. The way he lingered near the porch after the evening chores were done. The way Tempest would lift his head whenever they stood too close, as if reminding them both that love, like trust, was a wild thing. Not to be forced, only earned. One night, lightning cracked across the horizon. The storm rolled in hard and fast, tearing through the valley like a fury long held back. Bo and Ahyoka rushed to the barn to bring in the horses, rain stinging their faces, thunder shaking the ground. Tempest fought the wind like it was a rival. "Let him run," Ahyoka shouted above the storm. "He belongs to the wind." Bo grabbed her arm as another flash split the sky. "So do you," he said, his voice barely audible. "But sometimes even the wind needs shelter." For a heartbeat, their eyes locked, the storm raging around them, the air alive with fire and rain. Then, without another word, they pulled the barn doors shut, sealing themselves inside as the thunder rolled over the mountains. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the valley washed clean and quiet. The world smelled of rain and new beginnings. Bo stepped outside to see Tempest standing by the creek, his coat slick with water, steam rising from his body like smoke from a sacred fire. Ahyoka joined him, her hair damp, her eyes bright in the soft morning light. "He waited out the storm," Bo said. She smiled. So did we. That day, as they worked side by side rebuilding a fence the wind had torn down, Bo realized the truth of it. The desert didn't give second chances often, but when it did, you had to take them with both hands. He looked out across the valley, the fields, the creek, the woman beside him, and the black stallion grazing free. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man passing through. He felt like a man coming home. Time moved different in the valley, slower, quieter, like it had decided to stop keeping score. Days slipped into weeks, and weeks into months, until Bo Ransom and Ahyoka could no longer tell where one season ended and another began. Life had settled into rhythm, the kind only the desert could teach. The mornings always came first with color. The eastern sky blazed gold and crimson, spilling light over the mesas and casting long shadows across the fields. Every dawn, Bo rose before the sun, pulling on his worn boots and stepping into the crisp air that smelled of sage and dew. Tempest would already be there, waiting near the gate, head high, mane shimmering like black fire. Bo would pat his neck and whisper something half prayer, half promise. "Let's see what kind of day we're gonna make, partner." Then he and Ahyoka would ride out together, Tempest carrying them both, his stride smooth and proud, cutting through the orange dust like a shadow of light. From a distance, they looked like ghosts from another age, the white rancher and the Apache widow, riding side by side across a land that remembered every war, every heartbreak, and every storm. The desert wind carried their laughter, rare, quiet, but real, over the canyons and the riverbeds. Tempest wasn't wild anymore. He hadn't been tamed either. What existed between him and Bo wasn't control. It was understanding. The horse had become a symbol of balance, freedom that didn't have to be fought for anymore, only respected. Ahyoka had changed too. When Bo first came, her eyes had been hard as obsidian, her voice steady but distant, the tone of someone who'd seen too much death and learned to keep her heart under lock. Now, there was light in her. She smiled easier. Her laughter, soft, low, like wind rustling through leaves, had started to return. The people in town whispered about them. Some said it was strange, even scandalous, for a white man and an Apache woman to share land and work side by side. But the whispers died quickly. The valley didn't care for gossip. It cared for proof. And the proof was in how the ranch flourished. Crops grew taller. The creek ran clearer. Horses that had once been restless calmed under Bo's care. The ranch, which had nearly fallen to ruin, breathed again. Ayoka's people, from the nearby reservation, began visiting more often, bringing seeds, trading goods, sometimes just sharing stories by the fire. They watched Bo quietly at first, skeptical. But over time, they saw the way he worked, how he never tried to lead, only to help, how he spoke less and listened more. It was the kind of respect that didn't come from words. It came from sweat, from patience, from doing the work without asking for praise. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting everything in deep copper and rose, Bo and Ayoka rode out across the open plain. Tempest moved at a steady gallop, his hooves striking rhythm against the earth. They rode until the air turned cool and the shadows stretched long. "Reminds me of the first time I saw you," Bo said, pulling his hat low against the setting sun. Ayoka glanced at him, smiling. "And what did you see?" He thought for a moment, his voice soft. "A fire that didn't need saving, just someone to sit beside it." She laughed, a sound that mingled with the desert wind. "You speak like a poet, Bo Ransom." He grinned. "Nah, just a man who finally shut up long enough to listen." They slowed to a stop on a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the world stretched in every direction. Endless red and gold and silence. Ayoka looked out, her shawl fluttering behind her, her eyes distant but full of peace. "Do you ever think," she said softly, "that maybe people were never meant to own land or each other? Maybe we just pass through, and the earth decides if it'll remember us?" Bo nodded, watching the horizon. "Maybe so. But I reckon some places choose to keep certain folks a little longer." She turned to him, the sunset catching the copper in her eyes. "You believe the land can love?" Bo smiled faintly. "I do now." When the first winter came, it wasn't harsh like the ones Bo remembered up north. It was quiet, cold nights, long silences, stars bright enough to carve their shapes into the sky. They worked side by side through it all, fixing fences, hauling hay, tending to sick horses. On the coldest nights, they'd sit near the fire in Ayoka's cabin, sharing stories. Ayoka told him of her childhood, of running barefoot through canyons, of her father teaching her to listen to the heartbeat of the mountain. Bo told her of his father's ranch in Texas, how the dust storms used to tear through every spring, and how his old man used to say, "You can't fight the wind, boy. You just learn to bend with it." Sometimes they said nothing at all. They didn't need to. The kind of understanding that had grown between them didn't depend on conversation. It lived in small gestures. The passing of a coffee mug, the shared silence watching the fire burn low, the way her hand brushed his when she handed him tools. Tempest often lingered nearby during those evenings, his dark shape just outside the window. A sentinel, a spirit, a reminder of the freedom they both had learned to live beside. By spring, the land burst alive again. Wildflowers spread across the hills like spilled paint, yellow, white, purple. The creek sang louder. The air smelled of mesquite blooms and new grass. The ranch was thriving, and so were they. One morning, as they rode across the dunes, the sun rose behind them, setting Ayoka's hair aflame with gold. Bo watched her, the way the light caught her cheekbones, the way the wind carried her laughter, and felt something in him shift. He'd known loneliness all his life. He'd worn it like a second skin. But now it felt far away, like a storm that had passed and left the air washed clean. He thought of saying something, anything, but didn't. Some feelings didn't need to be spoken. The desert understood silence better than words. Ahyoka must have felt it too, because after a while she turned and said, "There are things a person shouldn't try to conquer. Only walk beside." Bo nodded. "You talking about the horse, or me?" She smiled, her hand finding his, fingers warm against the desert wind. "Both." He squeezed gently. "Then I guess I finally understand what your people mean by spirit of the wind." She looked at him with something soft and certain. "You've learned the Apache heart, Bo Ransom." That evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, the world burned red. The same red as old clay and old blood and old promises. They stood together on the ridge again, Tempest behind them, tossing his mane into the wind. The stallion let out a long, powerful whinny that echoed across the valley, rolling through the air like thunder wrapped in song. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, ancient, proud, and grateful. Bo looked out toward the horizon and spoke, his voice steady but full of wonder. "There are things in this life a man ain't meant to win, only to walk beside, if he's lucky." Ahyoka turned to him, her smile tender, eyes glowing like the last ember of a dying fire. "And now you understand," she said. "You've found peace, and that's rarer than victory." Bo reached for her hand, their fingers intertwined, calloused, strong, real. The sun's last light hit her hair, turning it to flame. For a moment, everything stilled. The wind, the world, even time itself. And in that stillness, Bo felt it, that deep, quiet knowing that comes when a man finally finds what he's been searching for his whole life. Not land, not glory, not even forgiveness. Between freedom and love. Between the past and what comes next. Between a man, a woman, and the wild soul that brought them together. As the first stars pierced the indigo sky, Tempest reared, his cry ringing out one last time, not as defiance, but as a blessing. The sound rolled over the hills, carried by the wind, until it became part of the desert's eternal song. Ahyoka leaned into Bo, her voice a whisper against the wind. "The earth is watching us," she said. Bo nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "Then let it see something worth remembering." They stood there long after the sun was gone, two silhouettes against a sea of red dust and endless sky, until the night wrapped them in its quiet, and the world, for once, was at peace.